19th November 1942, 7:30 hours, Soviet front lines north of Stalingrad. The frozen steppe trembled. Captain Ivan Petrov of the Soviet 5th Tank Army pressed his hands against the walls of his dugout as the earth itself seemed to convulse with rage. Outside, in the pre-dawn darkness, over 3,500 Soviet artillery pieces had opened fire simultaneously along a front stretching 250 kilometers. The barrage was apocalyptic: howitzers, mortars, Katyusha rocket launchers, all unleashing a storm of steel and fire on the Romanian Third Army positions to the north of Stalingrad. The sound was beyond deafening, a physical force that compressed the chest and rattled teeth, a thunderclap that seemed to have no end. Romanian trenches simply ceased to exist, erased by concentrated firepower that reduced entire battalions to smoking craters in 80 minutes of unrelenting bombardment. Petrov checked his watch. 8:50 hours. In 10 minutes, he and thousands of other Soviet tankers would climb into their T-34s and KV-1s and surge forward through the snow and smoke to execute the most ambitious encirclement operation of the war. For months, the world had watched Stalingrad burn, had seen the Germans grind closer to victory, had wondered if the Soviet Union could survive. What the world didn't know was that while Stalingrad bled, Soviet high command had been planning something audacious, something that would turn the hunters into the hunted and trap the entire German 6th Army in a steel noose. This is the story of Operation Uranus, the perfect encirclement that changed the course of World War II. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the Second World War. Where are you watching from? And could you have kept such a massive operation secret from one of history's most formidable intelligence services? To understand how the Soviets executed the perfect encirclement at Stalingrad, we must first understand the strategic situation in the autumn of 1942 and the brilliant minds who conceived Operation Uranus. By November, the battle for Stalingrad had been raging for 3 months. General Friedrich Paulus's 6th Army, over 270,000 men, had fought its way into the city and controlled roughly 90% of the ruins. German forces were on the verge of reaching the Volga River along its entire length, which would effectively cut off the Soviet 62nd Army and end organized resistance. To the world and to German high command, it appeared that Stalingrad's fall was merely a matter of time, perhaps days or weeks. Adolf Hitler was so confident that he had already announced to the German people that Stalingrad would soon be captured, that the campaign in southern Russia was succeeding, that victory in the east was within reach. But Hitler and his generals had made a catastrophic oversight. They had become so fixated on Stalingrad itself that they had ignored the bigger picture, particularly the dangerous vulnerability of their extended flanks. The German 6th Army's flanks, the forces protecting the northern and southern approaches to Stalingrad, were not held by Wehrmacht troops but by allied Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian armies. These forces were poorly equipped compared to German standards, inadequately trained for the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front, and critically short of anti-tank weapons and armor. German intelligence officers had repeatedly warned that these Allied armies represented a critical weakness, but their concerns were dismissed. Hitler and his staff were convinced that the Soviets were exhausted, that the Red Army had no reserves left, that any Soviet buildup was defensive in nature. They were catastrophically wrong. While the world watched Stalingrad burn, Marshal Georgy Zhukov and General Alexander Vasilevsky were planning one of the most audacious military operations of the war. Zhukov was Stalin's most trusted commander, the man who had saved Moscow in 1941, a ruthless and brilliant strategist who understood both the capabilities and limitations of the Red Army. Vasilevsky was chief of the General Staff, a meticulous planner with a genius for coordinating complex, large-scale operations. In late September 1942, Stalin summoned both men to the Kremlin for a secret conference. The meeting was so classified that even most Politburo members were excluded. Stalin posed a simple question. Could the Red Army launch a major counteroffensive while Stalingrad still held? Not just a local counterattack, but something decisive, something that could change the entire strategic situation. Zhukov and Vasilevsky studied the maps and made a bold proposal. Rather than pour more reserves into Stalingrad's meat grinder, they would husband those resources for a massive double envelopment. Soviet forces would attack simultaneously from the north and south, smashing through the weak Romanian armies, then driving deep into the German rear to link up west of Stalingrad. If successful, the operation would surround the entire Sixth Army, over 250,000 soldiers in a giant pocket. It was the classic Kesselschlacht, the cauldron battle, that the Germans themselves had used with devastating effect at Kiev, Minsk, and Vyazma. Now the Soviets would turn the tables. Stalin listened, asked probing questions about logistics, reserves, and timing, then approved the plan. But he imposed one absolute requirement: complete secrecy. If the Germans discovered the buildup, they would either attack preemptively or withdraw from Stalingrad, and the opportunity would be lost. The operation was codenamed Uranus after the Greek god of the sky, and its success would depend on deception, planning, and flawless execution. The planning for Operation Uranus was a masterpiece of operational security and military logistics. Between late September and mid-November 1942, the Soviet High Command assembled massive forces north and south of Stalingrad, while keeping the buildup completely hidden from German intelligence. This was an extraordinary achievement considering the scale of the operation. The Northern Pincer, officially designated as Operation Uranus North, was assigned to the Southwestern Front under General Nikolai Vadutin and the Don Front under General Konstantin Rokossovsky. Together, these forces comprised over 400,000 troops, 900 tanks, 230 regiments of artillery, and 300 aircraft. The Southern Pincer, Operation Uranus South, was assigned to the Stalingrad Front under General Andrei Yeryomenko. This force included over 330,000 troops, 400 tanks, and 180 regiments of artillery. In total, Operation Uranus would commit over 1 million Soviet soldiers, 13,500 artillery pieces of all calibers, 900 tanks, mostly T-34 medium tanks and KV-1 heavy tanks, and over 1,100 aircraft from the Soviet Air Force. It was the largest concentration of Soviet military power since the beginning of the war, and assembling it without German detection required extraordinary measures. All troop movements occurred at night. Units marched or moved by rail under cover of darkness, then concealed themselves in forests and villages during daylight hours. Tanks and vehicles were camouflaged with white paint and cloth to blend with the snow-covered landscape. Radio silence was absolute. All communications were conducted by courier or landline telephone. Deception operations were implemented to convince the Germans that any detected buildup was merely defensive repositioning. Soviet intelligence also planted false information. NKVD operatives fed German agents misleading reports about Soviet weakness, exaggerating casualties, and suggesting the Red Army lacked reserves for major operations. Soviet radio operators transmitted fake communications suggesting defensive preparations rather than offensive buildup. Dummy positions were established to draw German aerial reconnaissance away from actual assembly areas. The logistical challenge was enormous. Over 111,000 tons of ammunition had to be stockpiled at forward dumps. Fuel for the tank armies had to be transported and hidden. Food for over 1 million soldiers had to be accumulated without alerting German observers. Medical facilities had to be established to handle expected casualties. All of this occurred while the battle for Stalingrad continued to rage, consuming Soviet resources and attention. German intelligence detected some unusual activity, but catastrophically underestimated its scale and significance. Luftwaffe reconnaissance reported Soviet troop movements, but weather limited flights, and many reports were dismissed as exaggerated. General Paulus's intelligence staff noted increased Soviet activity north and south of the city, but assessed it as defensive reinforcement or preparations for local counterattacks, nothing more. Higher command, fixated on Stalingrad, paid little attention. By mid-November, the trap was set. The Romanian Third Army held a 140-kilometer front north of Stalingrad with approximately 150,000 troops, but they were thinly spread, poorly equipped, and supported by only a handful of German units. The Romanian Fourth Army held the southern flank with similar weakness. Facing them were overwhelming Soviet forces, hidden and waiting. The Romanians had no idea they were about to be hit by a hammer. Operation Uranus began at precisely 7:30 hours on 19 November 1942, with the artillery barrage that Captain Petrov felt shaking his dugout. The northern pincers bombardment was devastating and systematic. Soviet artillery had been pre-registered on Romanian positions for days, meaning gunners knew exact ranges and coordinates. When the guns opened fire, shells fell with terrifying accuracy on command posts, communication centers, artillery positions, and forward trenches. The Romanian soldiers had never experienced anything like it. Most were conscripts, inadequately trained and equipped, suffering from low morale and poor leadership. Their trenches, constructed in the frozen ground, offered some protection, but nothing could withstand the concentration of firepower now being directed at them. High-explosive shells collapsed bunkers, shrapnel scythed through exposed positions. Katyusha rockets, the dreaded Stalin's organs, screamed down in clusters, saturating entire sectors with explosives. Romanian officers tried desperately to organize defensive fire and rally their troops, but communications were cut almost immediately. Command posts were destroyed. Radio sets were smashed. Telephone lines were severed. Within minutes, the Romanian frontline units were isolated, unable to coordinate, unable to call for support, simply trying to survive in their shattered trenches as the bombardment continued without pause. At 8:50 hours, the artillery barrage shifted to targets deeper in the Romanian rear, supply depots, reserve positions, roads and bridges. And at that moment, Soviet infantry and tanks surged forward through the snow and smoke. The Soviet 5th Tank Army, 21st Army, and 65th Army attacked simultaneously along multiple axes, overwhelming Romanian defenses through sheer weight of numbers and firepower. Captain Petrov climbed into his T-34 tank, part of the 26th Tank Corps, and gave the order to advance. Around him, hundreds of Soviet tanks rolled forward in waves, their tracks churning through snow, diesel engines roaring. The T-34 was perfectly suited for this terrain, and this battle wide tracks that distributed weight and prevented bogging in snow, a powerful 76mm gun, sloped armor that deflected shots, and a diesel engine that was more reliable in extreme cold than German gasoline engines. The Romanian defenders, those who had survived the barrage, watched in horror as the Soviet armor approached. They had few anti-tank weapons, mostly obsolete 37mm guns that were ineffective against T-34s. Romanian artillery tried to engage but was quickly suppressed by Soviet counter-battery fire. Within hours, the Romanian Third Army was disintegrating. Some units fought bravely, holding positions until overrun and annihilated, but most broke and fled in panic, abandoning weapons and equipment in their desperate rush to escape. German units attempted to plug the gaps. The 48th Panzer Corps, positioned in reserve, was ordered to counterattack, but it had only about 100 tanks, many of them older Panzer III models inferior to Soviet T-34s. The German panzers attacked piecemeal in small groups and were defeated in detail by overwhelming Soviet armor. By the end of the first day, Soviet forces had advanced over 50 kilometers, smashing a gaping hole in the German northern flank. The southern pincer struck the next day, 20th November 1942, at 1,000 hours. The Stalingrad front unleashed its own devastating artillery preparation against the Romanian Fourth Army south of the city. The pattern was identical: overwhelming bombardment followed by mass tank and infantry assaults. And once again, Romanian defenses collapsed under the onslaught. General Eremenko commanded the southern attack personally, coordinating the 57th Army, 51st Army, and 13th Mechanized Corps. His forces included battle-hardened units that had been carefully husbanded during the Stalingrad fighting, held in reserve specifically for this moment. Now they were unleashed with devastating effect. The Romanian Fourth Army, like its northern counterpart, was stretched thin and poorly equipped. When Soviet tanks appeared through the morning fog, T-34s and KV-1s advancing in coordinated formations, Romanian anti-tank defenses proved wholly inadequate. The few German units in the sector fought with their characteristic skill and tenacity, but they were vastly outnumbered and could only delay, not stop, the Soviet advance. One German officer, commanding a battalion of the 29th Motorized Infantry Division, later described the scene. "We saw them coming across the steppe like a brown wave, hundreds of tanks, thousands of infantry. We fought with everything we had, but it was like trying to stop the ocean with a bucket. Our anti-tank guns destroyed a dozen Soviet tanks, but for every one we killed, 10 more appeared. By afternoon, we were surrounded and fighting in all directions. By evening, half my battalion was dead or wounded, and we were retreating in chaos." The Soviet advance southward was equally dramatic as the northern offensive. By the end of 20th November, Soviet mechanized forces had penetrated over 40 kilometers into the German rear. Romanian units were streaming back in disorder. German commanders were sending increasingly desperate reports to higher headquarters, requesting permission to withdraw from Stalingrad, warning that encirclement was imminent. General Paulus, commanding the 6th Army inside Stalingrad, received fragmentary reports of the Soviet breakthroughs, but initially didn't grasp the magnitude of the disaster. His attention was focused on the fighting inside the city, where his forces were making final preparations for what they believed would be the decisive assault to reach the Volga along its entire length. The idea that his entire army might be about to be surrounded seemed almost impossible. But Marshal Zhukov, coordinating the operation from a forward command post, could see the bigger picture unfolding exactly as planned. The northern and southern pincers were advancing faster than anticipated. Romanian resistance had collapsed more quickly than expected. German counterattacks were being defeated or bypassed. The two Soviet spearheads were racing toward each other, and between them lay the entire German 6th Army, still focused on Stalingrad, still unaware of the catastrophe about to engulf them. On 21st November, Soviet reconnaissance units from the northern and southern pincers reported they were within 20 kilometers of each other, approaching the town of Kalach on the Don River. The link-up was imminent. Zhukov sent an encrypted message to Stalin: "Uranus proceeding according to plan. Encirclement expected within 24 hours." The historic link-up occurred on 22 November 1942 at approximately 1600 hours near Kalach. A Soviet tank brigade from the 26th Tank Corps Northern Pincer met units of the 4th Mechanized Corps Southern Pincer near the Sovietskoye State Farm, about 8 kilometers southeast of Kalach. Tank crews climbed from their vehicles, embraced, laughed, and wept. They had done it. The trap had closed. The scene was captured by Soviet war correspondents and photographers who had been accompanying the advancing forces, knowing they were witnessing a historic moment. The images show Soviet soldiers celebrating, their faces blackened by smoke and oil, their uniforms covered in snow, their expressions a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. One famous photograph shows two tank commanders shaking hands beneath the red banner of the Soviet Union, with destroyed Romanian equipment visible in the background. But there was no time for extended celebration. Soviet commanders immediately began organizing defensive positions facing both inward and outward. Facing inward, they would contain the trapped German Sixth Army. Facing outward, they would defend against the German relief attempts that were certain to come. Engineers began laying minefields. Infantry dug trenches. Artillery was positioned to cover likely German breakout routes. Inside the newly formed pocket, approximately 290,000 Axis soldiers were now surrounded. The entire German Sixth Army, roughly 265,000 men, portions of the 4th Panzer Army, approximately 15,000, and remnants of 2 Romanian divisions, approximately 10,000. They occupied an area roughly 60 kilometers east to west and 40 kilometers north to south, centered on Stalingrad itself. General Paulus, finally grasping the magnitude of the disaster, immediately requested permission to break out westward. His staff officers urged immediate action while the Soviet encirclement was still forming and relatively weak. General Hans Hube, commanding the 14th Panzer Corps, argued passionately that the army must abandon Stalingrad, abandon heavy equipment that couldn't move quickly, and fight its way west to link up with German forces outside the pocket. But Hitler refused. On 24 November, a message arrived from the Führer's headquarters. The Sixth Army would hold Stalingrad and form an all-around defense. Hermann Göring had assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe could supply the surrounded army by air. Relief forces were being assembled under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein and would break through to rescue the Sixth Army. Paulus, ever the obedient soldier, complied with Hitler's order despite his own misgivings and the protests of his subordinates. That decision sealed the fate of the Sixth Army. The Soviet encirclement, initially a loose ring, solidified daily as reinforcements arrived, defenses were strengthened, and the noose tightened. The perfect encirclement was complete. Operation Uranus succeeded beyond even Soviet expectations. In just 4 days, Soviet forces had surrounded the largest German field army on the Eastern Front, eliminated Romanian armies totaling over 200,000 men, killed, captured, or scattered, and fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the war. But success came at significant cost. Soviet casualties during the offensive phase totaled approximately 155,000 killed, wounded, or missing. Heavy losses, but acceptable given the strategic gains. Why did Operation Uranus succeed so spectacularly? The answer lies in multiple factors, all of which had to align for the perfect encirclement to occur. First was the operational security and deception that kept the Germans ignorant of the massive Soviet buildup. This allowed Soviet forces to achieve complete surprise, hitting the Romanians before they could prepare adequate defenses or receive German reinforcements. Second was the choice of targets. Zhukov and Vasilevsky deliberately attacked the weakest points in the German line, the Romanian armies, rather than German forces. This was not cowardice or opportunism but sound military strategy. The Romanians, through no fault of their own, lacked the equipment, training, and support to resist a major Soviet offensive. By attacking them, the Soviets bypassed the strongest German defenses and struck where success was most likely. Third was the concentration of force at decisive points. Rather than distributing their reserves evenly along the front, Soviet commanders massed overwhelming strength at the breakthrough sectors. This created local superiority of 5, 1, or even 10, 1 in some areas, making Romanian resistance impossible. The principle of mass, concentrating superior force at the decisive point, had been a fundamental military concept since Napoleon, and the Soviets executed it perfectly. Fourth was the coordination between different Soviet fronts and armies. Operation Uranus required precise timing. The northern and southern pincers had to attack within hours of each other to prevent the Germans from shifting reserves. The link-up had to occur at a specified location and time. Artillery had to suppress defenses just long enough for armor to advance. All of this required detailed planning, effective communication, and disciplined execution by commanders at every level. Fifth was the quality of Soviet equipment and tactics. The T-34 tank, often considered the best tank of World War II, proved superior to most German armor in this operation. Soviet artillery, particularly the massed Katyusha rocket launchers, delivered devastating firepower. Soviet tactics had evolved significantly since the disasters of 1941. Deep operations, combined arms coordination, and exploitation of breakthroughs were now executed competently. Sixth was the weather and terrain. The November snows and freezing temperatures favored the Soviets, who were better equipped for winter warfare than their Romanian opponents. The open steppe terrain allowed rapid tank advances and prevented the Germans from establishing strong defensive positions in depth. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, was the strategic patience of Soviet high command. While Stalingrad bled, while casualties mounted horrifically inside the city, Zhukov and Vasilevsky resisted pressure to commit their reserves to the urban battle. Instead, they husbanded those resources, waited for the right moment, and then struck with overwhelming force at the enemy's weakest point. This required courage, discipline, and confidence that the Stalingrad defenders could hold long enough for Uranus to succeed. The aftermath of Operation Uranus's success played out over the following months as the trapped Sixth Army slowly died inside the pocket. Field Marshal von Manstein's relief attempt in December 1943. Operation Winter Storm failed when Paulus, following Hitler's orders, refused to break out to meet the relief force. The Luftwaffe's promised airlift delivered only a fraction of required supplies, and the Sixth Army starved and froze through the terrible winter of 1940–43. On 31 January 1943, Paulus surrendered. On 2 February, the last German resistance in Stalingrad ceased. Of the 290,000 soldiers trapped by Operation Uranus, approximately 140,000 had died during the encirclement from combat, starvation, cold, and disease. Another 60,000 had been evacuated by air before the airfields were lost. The remaining 91,000 marched into Soviet captivity, from which only about 6,000 would ever return home. The strategic impact of Operation Uranus was profound and lasting. It marked the turning point of the war on the Eastern Front. After Stalingrad, Germany was permanently on the defensive in the East, never again mounting a strategic offensive. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. Allied morale soared while Axis morale plummeted. The Soviet Union had demonstrated it could not only resist German offensives, but execute sophisticated, large-scale counteroffensives that destroyed entire enemy armies. Operation Uranus also validated Soviet military doctrine that had been developing throughout the war. The concept of deep operations, penetrating enemy defenses, exploiting breakthroughs with mobile forces, encircling and destroying enemy formations, became the template for subsequent Soviet offensives. The Red Army would use similar tactics repeatedly as it drove westward toward Berlin. At Korsun-Cherkasy, in Operation Bagration, in the Vistula-Oder offensive, and finally in the Battle of Berlin itself. For the individuals who executed Operation Uranus, the success brought both glory and continued hardship. Marshal Zhukov became the Soviet Union's most celebrated military commander, eventually accepting Germany's surrender in Berlin in May 1945. General Vasilevsky continued as chief of the General Staff, planning subsequent operations. Many junior officers who commanded tank brigades or rifle divisions in Uranus rose to command armies and fronts as the war continued. For Captain Petrov, the tank commander who had participated in the Northern Breakthrough, the war continued for another 2.5 years. He fought in subsequent operations across Ukraine, Poland, and into Germany itself. He survived the war, was decorated as a hero of the Soviet Union, and returned home to teach at a tank warfare academy, passing on the lessons learned in the snows outside Stalingrad. The legacy of Operation Uranus extends far beyond World War II. It stands as one of the finest examples of operational art in military history. The level of warfare between tactics, fighting individual battles, and strategy, achieving political objectives through military means. The operation demonstrated that with proper planning, deception, concentration of force, and bold execution, even a numerically inferior force on the defensive can turn the tables and destroy a powerful enemy army. Military academies worldwide study Operation Uranus as a masterclass in encirclement warfare. The operation is examined for its planning, its deception measures, its coordination of multiple fronts, and its exploitation of enemy weaknesses. Modern military doctrine on maneuver warfare, particularly in the U.S. Army's air-land battle concept and subsequent operational doctrines, owes significant debt to the principles demonstrated at Stalingrad. But beyond the military lessons, Operation Uranus represents something profound about the nature of war and human conflict. The Germans, confident in their superiority, had become fixated on a symbolic objective, a city bearing Stalin's name, while ignoring the broader strategic picture. They had dismissed warnings about their vulnerable flanks, underestimated their enemy's capabilities, and allowed hubris to cloud judgment. The Soviets, despite suffering catastrophic casualties and territorial losses throughout 1941 and 1942, had learned from their defeats, adapted their tactics, and maintained the strategic patience to strike when conditions favored success. The frozen steppe north of Stalingrad, where Captain Petrov's tank had rolled forward on 19 November 1942, is quiet now, farmland stretching to the horizon, the scars of battle long since healed. But the memory of what happened there remains vivid in Russian historical consciousness. Operation Uranus is celebrated as the moment when the tide turned, when the Soviet Union transitioned from desperate defense to victorious offense, when the impossible became possible through planning, courage, and sacrifice. Marshal Zhukov, reflecting on Operation Uranus years after the war, wrote in his memoirs, "The encirclement at Stalingrad was not the result of luck or accident. It was the result of careful planning, detailed preparation, absolute secrecy, and bold execution. We knew we had one chance to destroy the German Sixth Army. If we failed, if they detected our preparations and withdrew or reinforced, the opportunity would be lost forever. So we planned carefully, moved secretly, struck decisively, and succeeded completely. That is how wars are won, not through improvisation or desperate gambles, but through professional military art executed with precision." For the soldiers who executed that plan, tankers like Captain Petrov, artillerymen who fired the opening barrages, infantrymen who advanced through snow and fire, commanders who coordinated the massive operation, Operation Uranus represented the culmination of 18 months of learning through defeat how to fight and win against the Wehrmacht. They had paid a terrible price in blood to gain that knowledge, losing millions of soldiers in 1941 and 1942. But they had learned, adapted, and ultimately mastered the operational art of modern warfare. The perfect encirclement at Stalingrad was perfect not because it was executed without errors or casualties. There were plenty of both, but because it achieved its strategic objective completely, surrounding and ultimately destroying an entire enemy army while fundamentally shifting the balance of the war. In that sense, Operation Uranus stands alongside Cana, Sedan, and other legendary encirclement battles as proof that superior strategy and execution can defeat superior force, that patience and planning can overcome immediate adversity, and that in war, the side that learns fastest often wins, regardless of initial setbacks. The trembling earth that Captain Petrov felt on that frozen November morning was not just artillery fire. It was the sound of the turning point, the moment when the hunted became hunters, when the besieged became liberators, when the Soviet Union began the long, bloody march from Stalingrad to Berlin. Operation Uranus was where that journey began, executed with precision and audacity that proved the Red Army had become a force capable of defeating the Wehrmacht at its own game. But while Operation Uranus was closing the trap at Stalingrad, another momentous battle was reaching its climax in the deserts of North Africa, where British and Commonwealth forces were pursuing Rommel's Afrika Korps after the victory at El Alamein. Join us next time as we uncover the story of the Desert Fox's long retreat and the Allied campaign that would eventually lead to the invasion of Italy. Subscribe now and never miss another untold story from the Second World War.